All right, welcome to the new JFK show number 229. We're going to have a part of a 3-hour presentation with Doug Horn, who's one of my favorite researchers, and Larry has some slide presentations. But before that, we're going to have Jim give an intro to what it's all about tonight.
Well, Gary, you did a pretty good job of covering the bases. Doug Horn did a 3.5-hour interview with St. Patrick, and it covered really a lot of the history of the JFK assassination, where Doug, of course, had served as the senior analyst for military records for the Assassination Records Review Board, and would subsequently publish 4 volumes. I got them right here.
Five, boss.
5, actually, you're right. Here's volume 4, which is the one in which he discusses the Zapruder film. And Larry has extracted from this very significant audio archive some key passages, in particular, as Larry will explain, where Horn is giving a critique of Robert Groden's role in the history of JFK assassination research. Very, very significant. Larry.
It is not pretty.
Well, parallel to that, we're going to run some slides from a show that we did actually a couple of years ago, Jim. And we actually talked about everything that Douglas, alludes to, in this interview with St. Patrick. And it's kind of, comes full circle, because we did this a couple of years ago. I'm not, putting down Douglas or anything, because he really goes into a lot of detail of what the Zapruder film and everything, obviously 3.5 hours. And even Dr. Mantic, after listening to this show, he was completely flabbergasted. He was completely in agreement with everything that Douglas was presenting, and especially with the work that Sidney Wilkerson and Tom, what's his last name? I forget, that they did on the Zapruder film, specifically frame 317. But what we want to do here is we want to go and zoom in to the interview specifically at 1:51. Okay, the minute, an hour and 51 minutes. And if you guys can hear me, I'm just going to run this through for a little bit, and then we can stop and discuss it, and then run some slides and whatever. And this is where Douglas Horn begins to address Robert Groden and his role in the Zapruder film, and so on and so forth.
Now, Larry, you're not any longer on full screen, and of course you were showing that portion of the Ulchin 6 that has been subject of such controversy, where astonishingly Robert Groden to this day insists that the figure at the center, known as Doorman, was not Lee Harvey Oswald, but rather Billy Lovelady, which gives an indication of his role in the history of JK research.
No, that's because I'm getting ready to run the audio clip right here. Let's go.
Go for it.
Made by Robert Groden at the Dallas conference after Sidney and Tom screened their film. He made some claims about their work which are incorrect. He made some claims in episode 1 and 103 which are not true. And I'd like to talk about his claims versus what people should understand is really the truth. And I think people will find that really interesting, and they can look at these images you posted while I talk. How does that sound?
That sounds fine. And for those who have the website up at home, this is section 3. Go right ahead.
Okay, ST, I'm going to move into what I consider the heart of this discussion, which is false claims made by Robert Groden about the work of Sidney Wilkinson and Tom Whitehead. And I don't find this particularly pleasant to do, but I have such loyalty to my 2 friends in California. I have total faith in their integrity. They haven't altered one thing in this 35 millimeter Duke negative they have. They haven't altered anything. All they've done is scan it and make digital copies that they can study. They would never alter evidence or cheat like that. And they've got, 75 film professionals who have looked at it. And so when I hear people denigrating their work, even though it means I'm going to have to use some sharp elbows here and push back against Mr. Groden. But I'm not only pushing back against him, I'm pushing back against other people who have attacked our work. People like Josiah Thompson, Tink Thompson, and Raleigh Zavada, the former ARB consultant, who come to this case with a very strong bias leaning toward authenticity and who just don't want to be bothered, don't want to consider new evidence.
You want to explain, Dr. Fetzer, what who those people are, and what Douglas is alluding to there?
Well, of course, Josiah Thompson published 6 Seconds in Dallas back in 1967, which was based upon his study of frames of the Zapruder film. He'd actually had access to the frames at Time Life magazine. There's an interesting history involved in that altogether. Originally, he was going to have permission to publish the frames, but Time Life backed out, and he published instead charcoal sketches. What's interesting is that his book includes, for example, the diagram approved by Robert McClellan showing a massive blowout at the back of JFK's head. And most strikingly, in relation to the Zapruder film, the scientific analysis of 2 hits between 312 and 313. There's a forward motion of the head, which all that remains of the separate shot JFK sustained at the back of the head after the driver, William Greer, brought the limousine to a halt to make sure he would be killed. He was hit in the back of the head. He slumped forward. Jack eased him back up and was looking him right in the face when he was hit in the right temple by a frangible exploding bullet that set up shockwaves that blew his brains out the back of his already weakened cranium, and he slumped to the left. Now, in the extant film, they had to remove all of that evidence of multiple shots from different directions, or a conspiracy would have been self-evident. And in doing so, they removed too many frames, so that all that remained was from 312 to 313 forward motion. And then to the left, it's a jerky motion back and to the left, even though he simply slumped to the left. Now, in Josiah's book, and this was by far the most important contribution it made, it does a very scientific study by appropriate reference points showing the motion of the head and thereby establishing the double hit theory. And yet, at the end of his book, he writes that nothing in this book proves conspiracy when the 2 examples I've just given already did. Vince Salandria has taken credit for being the first to call out Josiah Thompson as working the other side. Rolly Zavada was an expert from Kodak, but he was actually an expert on the celluloid. He was not an expert on content analysis, but only on the quality of the film. And he could attest that the Zapruder film is an authentic Kodak film. But of course, that's insignificant and trivial in relation to whether or not its content is authentic or not. And indeed, I'm very suspicious by Zavada's role here, because when they edited the film, it was such a massive project. They had to blow up each frame, do the alteration, which Doug's friends Sidney and Tom established to have been done very crudely in relation to the blowout at the back of the head, then shrink back the film frames. And because if they hadn't reshot the film sequence, it would have been obvious it had been edited. They had to reshoot the film, and obviously it would have been indispensable to use original Kodak film. So Zavada makes the fallacious inference that since it's a authentic Kodak film, therefore the content must be an accurate depiction of what occurred. Rather, the opposite inference of what happened with George W. Bush fitness report, where Karen Hughes and Karl Rove had it retyped on a typewriter using a font that didn't exist at the time it had been dictated and typed, even though Dan Rather had verified it with his secretary who had recorded in the office or dictated and knew it was verbatim, word for word accurate. They argued that since the content, the paper, the document itself was fake, the content must be false. In this instance, with the Zapruder film, we have the opposite line of argument.
Now, despite all of this, I believe that Josiah did get credit for that sudden front and back millisecond movement of the head of JFK. Is that right?
Well, what I'm saying is that was the most important contribution made by the book. But
Yeah,
as we began to approach the 50th observance, I detected signs on the education forum that he was setting up to disavow conspiracy and, make his role, his final contribution as a deep state agent paramount. It turns out, incidentally, because he was now disavowing, conspiracy, and he wound up doing the first of what was supposed to be a series of 50 or 60 short interviews with a famous film producer for the New York Times. But the very first I dismembered, he was talking about the Umbrella Man and arguing that you can find an innocuous explanation for almost anything that is initially viewed as suspicious. I took it apart so substantially that they abandoned the project. And instead of a series of 60 of these short videos, they only produced the first. I'd also observed, by the way, that David Lifton had independently gone to Caltech with Richard Feynman with blow-ups of the crucial frames 312, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. And Feynman himself, a world-famous physicist, had taken a ruler and applied them to the photographs, the frames that Lifton had brought, and he himself had established the forward motion from 312 to 313 in relation to the back and to the left motion of the subsequent film. So there was an independent establishment of the double hit theory by the world famous physicist Richard Feynman. In my judgment, Josiah Thompson has totally discredited himself, just as we are going to hear here from Doug Horn how Robert Groden has, in a parallel fashion, completely discredited himself. And where Rolly Zavada's role in all of this has been massively miscast, because all he could testify to based on his own competence was the authenticity of the celluloid, nothing about the accuracy of the contents there on display.
Now, also, is it not true also that Douglas Horn had, when he was working for the ARRB, had tried to get the original camera to be used at Dealey Plaza to reenact the assassination? I mean, not the assassination, but the sequence there, using the same camera to verify, the sequence, and not only the sequence, but the imprint on the
ghost panels and so forth.
Right.
Yes, you're 100% correct, Larry. Doug sought to.
It never happened.
It would have been an obvious thing to do, but he was precluded from doing it. It was ruled out, which is one more sign that this wasn't really an investigation intended to expose the truth, but rather once more to conceal it.
So let's continue here.
So I'm here to defend the work of my friends because I believe in their work, and I'm putting my reputation on the line, defending theirs, and I'm totally comfortable with that. And facts matter, doggone it. Facts matter, the truth matters, and that's why I've come out of retirement here to do this long podcast, is to defend the work of my friends, which I believe in. So here we go. Let me talk about how the interchange that occurred between Sidney and Tom and Robert Groden during this past year. One of Robert's friends contacted you, and he said Robert wanted to talk to me, and I didn't know what that was about, but I guessed it was probably the Z film. I agreed to talk to him, and sure enough, it was about the Z film. And Robert said he was about to publish something critical of my claims about the film's alteration. And basically, my claims about the film's alteration is a discussion of the work of Sidney and Tom, plus a discussion of a couple of other issues of interest to the research community, like the car turn and the car stop. But mostly it's about Sidney and Tom's work. And so I agreed to talk to Robert. We had a long phone discussion. This is probably last spring. I'm trying to do this by memory. And we talked and talked about how we disagreed. And then I told him, with their permission, that Sidney and Tom, who he was aware of, because I wrote about their work in 2009 in volume 4 of my book. I said, Sidney and Tom are interested in exchanging information with you in the interests of moving the ball forward down the field, to use a football analogy. And they're willing to share with you some of their best digital scans if you will share with them your best film element. And I told him that what I meant by sharing was that they were willing, if necessary, to fly him to Los Angeles, to pay his way to come to Los Angeles where they live, to see their work on large, high-resolution screens and even in screening studios, and to have them explain what they have done to him so he can better understand it.
Larry, if I might interject, if you might pause it.
Yes, sir.
I have been in Sydney's studio. I have seen the film. The resolution is just breathtaking. You can't believe how clearly you can see what they're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I do suggest, by the way, visually going forward a couple of frames here to one related to the Zapruder film, Larry, rather than what we're looking at, which was the original view of Grodin when he published JFK, The Case for Conspiracy, and maintained Lee was in the doorway, which of course he would abandon when he went to work for the House Select Committee by being their stooge in order to claim that in fact it was Billy Lovelady and not Lee. So I just suggest you go forward 2 frames here on the slides you have present.
Yeah, that's before he flipped.
Okay. I see what you mean. Okay. Well, actually, yeah. This is a slide that shows when he did that book with Modell. All right.
Yeah.
And this is a slide that shows Harold Weisberg's chapter on the Lovelady thing, you know, with the, he called it the Lovelady caper, you know, or something like that. And and he did that study, that 9-point study, you know, on the shirt, and he wasn't even looking at the face, and you know how we took the overlays, you know, one step further, you know, with the facial recognition. He was only working on the shirt, you know, and talking about that. For example, they never called Altgens to testify until he had been goaded into examining the picture by the New York Herald Tribune. And it took them, you know, all this time to do that, to bring him into the Warren Commission. I think it was until July or June of 1964 when he had already forgotten most of the what had happened that day. But anyway, and we have talked about this many times. Page 187 of his book, "Killing of a President," and we'll get back to this because right now what Douglas is talking about is the Zapruder film, but what the point here is that Grodin, and we're going to see later on some really interesting information on before he started to work for the HSCA, he was in dire straits. Okay, after publishing that book, apparently it didn't sell that well. And there's information and there are letters at the Weisberg site because we have spoken about this before, that Weisberg was godfather to his oldest son. So they were family, you know, at least, you know, in the sense of being not the blood lines, you know, but family in the sense of, as, you know, when one is a godfather, godmother, whatever.
Right.
Yeah, right. And
just a clear time when he flipped, you know? I mean, Robert Grodin flipped.
And at the time, Grodin and Weisberg were very, very close. And some of the inference has been that Grodin tried to get into Weisberg's inner circle, okay, so that he could find out what Weisberg was doing, all right? And I'm going to tell you, some of the information there written by Weisberg is very telling because at the time in the summer of '76, Grodin was in dire straits. He needed money, didn't have any money. And this letter right here is talking about his wife asking Weisberg, the Weisberg family, for money, you know, to borrow money, okay? And that's this letter here is where he's saying, you know, look, you know, we just had to pay a roofer, you know, $3,000, you know, we don't have any. But then what happens here is that 11/28/1976, this is where Grodin goes to Colorado with Bruton, with Kenneth Bruton, and he doesn't tell Weisberg about his mission. And this happens in the middle of November the 13th, the weekend of November the 13th. Okay, and this one here is very, very telling because it says, consistent with this and with the necessary ellipsis, Robert Groden told me this morning that he had been off on a short trip, but Groden didn't tell Weisberg. You know, what's really strange about this is they were such collaborators, but in this particular trip, which had to do with the Oswald Lovelady shirt, Groden didn't tell Weisberg, what his trip was all about for the HSCA.
Yeah, if you're a JFK researcher and you're working with someone else, that's the first thing you're going to tell them.
Right. So and remember we've talked about the Martin film and DCA film, and all this, and this is exactly what this is all about, where Weisberg is questioning, what was this trip all about, and thanks to Carl Golovin, we with the recordings. Remember, Gary and I did those transcripts. Remember, Gary?
Yeah.
On the trip to Aurora, Colorado, where Lovelady told Bruton and Groden that Lee could have been on the steps. Okay.
Yeah.
Yet Bruton decided, and he elected to not go further into that issue, and he changed the subject. On the conversation, which, obviously, any lawyer, would know that that was something contrived, but this is the point of all this, Jim and Gary, is that Groden went to Colorado, on a mission, okay? And all of a sudden, he starts working for the HSCA. A couple of months before that, he was broke, okay? So, all of a sudden, we've got this situation here with a checkered colored shirt and the pocket and no pocket over here, and
Well, explain, Larry. These are photographs that Groden took out in Colorado of Billy Lovelady, wearing a red and black checkered shirt that was supposed to show he was a man in the doorway. Go to the other slide, Larry.
Yeah, but I wanted to go back to this one because you see when I'm circling here, you see Lee's shirt. Obviously, it's buttoned all the way. At least it looks like it's buttoned all the way to the top, right?
Yeah, but he didn't have any button.
And this is exactly where Weisberg called Groden out and said, "Why are you being such a crook? And you are showing this shirt buttoned all the way to the top. However, the man in the doorway does not have the shirt buttoned all the way to the top. His shirt is splayed all the way down to almost his navel, okay, as we showed earlier, okay, right here in the beginning, okay? Yet, in your book, you're showing the shirt and you're closing it as if it's the shirt of the checkered colored shirt,
Yeah. But it's not the same shirt. It's not the same guy. And what's stunning, go to the other page, Larry, the other slide. Yeah. What's stunning is he takes this photograph and the shirt he has on Billy Lovelady, which he claims to have been the shirt that Billy Lovelady was wearing that day, which we know from his FBI interview is not the case because he is shown here in the FBI photographs, the short sleeve red and white vertically striped shirt. Actually had a pocket in on the man they would like to pretend was Lee Oswald, but he's obviously not. He's obviously not the man in the doorway. He's a hefty guy, heavy of build. The man in the doorway was slight of build. He must outweigh the man in the doorway by 80 pounds, I would estimate. He has the profile of a gorilla, because of which I refer to him as Gorilla Man. The idea that he and Billy Lovelady would be the same person is absurd on multiple grounds. Where Billy himself, of course, insisted it was odd that he and Lee would be confused because he was 2 to 3 inches shorter and 15 to 20 pounds heavier. Well, the Gorilla Man is massively more heavy than that. I mean, it's all completely ridiculous. And there's Groden trying to merge it all together.
But what's really laughable about all this, Jim, is that even in his book, page 187, he publishes this guy with the flap, the pocket and the flap, and he's got Lovelady without the pocket and the flap, on the same page.
I know, Larry. That's why I love this page. This is a damning of Robert Groden right here. You got all the proof you can possibly have.
You don't need
You got the
anything
real
else.
love lady going to the FBI, the real shirt he was wearing. Here's Groden trying to fake him having worn a completely different shirt that doesn't even correspond to the shirt he wants to pretend was on the man in the doorway. It's a reductio to absurdity.
And the biggest falling out and the biggest argument that Weisberg had with Groden was this picture right here, because he's showing Lee's shirt,
It's missing the buttons. Yeah, it was so
right
raggedy.
at the top, and that's why
Those buttons are missing.
I know they're missing, but yet they've got it laid out,
like it was buttoned up. I see.
I mean, there cannot be more deception than this, Jim. Anyway, let's go on to Douglas, because I think Douglas, has a lot of really important stuff to talk about.
Sure, just leave one of these with a frame with Zapruder up, Larry, while he talks about the Zapruder film.
I don't have that here.
Well, that one right there is good enough. I mean, it's
this.
No, the one you just had has it.
The one you had, Larry.
That
right. Well, that'll do.
Yeah,
okay.
That'll do, because that's so damning. Put it full screen, though, Larry.
It's best Zapruder film, so they could digitally scan it. And they said, we want to digitally scan your best film.
Full screen, Larry.
In your presence. You won't be asked to leave the room. You can stay in the room. We're not going to have it overnight.
Thank you.
Arrive with your own film. You'll go home with your own film. We just would like a digital copy of your film because, it was made in 1968 by Moses Weitzman. It was in much better condition then. A lot less scratches, less mold on it. And they, of course, what they're interested in is what are these anomalies that they discovered, these black patches, what do they look like in the 1968 film? And so the offer was made by me as a middleman, and he listened politely. And then he told me a lie. I said, what is your best film element? And Robert said, I've had a lot of strokes. I'm not really sure about it, but I think it's a 16 millimeter Zapruder film is my best film element. And I knew immediately that was untrue. And I'll tell your audience why it's untrue. In 1988, a really interesting TV documentary came out on the 25th anniversary of the assassination called Who Shot President Kennedy? It was narrated by Walter Cronkite, but it was not a CBS product. The film was written, produced, and directed by Robert Richter. Now, Robert Richter is a former CBS employee. This documentary was his baby. And he basically put every conspiracy regarding every claim regarding problems with the evidence into his film, and then proceeded to analyze the claims. And by the end of the documentary, I think all he did is confuse the audience. I don't know if that was the intent or not, but he addressed the single bullet theory. He addressed David Lifton's claims that wounds were altered. He addressed claims regarding the so-called Black Dog Man photograph of the figure behind the retaining wall on the grassy knoll. He addressed a lot of subjects and then proceeded to do pros and cons. And by the end of the film, you didn't know what to think. But the point is, to obtain a good quality Zapruder film for his documentary, which was shown on PBS, by the way. It was shown on PBS a couple of times in 1988, and it was shown again early in 1992 by PBS, shortly after Oliver Stone's film came out. Oliver Stone's film, JFK. So the interest was revived by Stone's film, and PBS showed the documentary again, and that's when I videotaped it, was in late 91 or 92. So in this documentary, Richter shows this beautiful, absolutely crystal clear Zapruder film. And it turns out that I know where he got it from. He got a 35 millimeter duplicate negative of the Zapruder film from Robert Groden to use in that program. And how do I know that? I know that because Richter loaned it to David Lifton at the time. So at the time Richter had it for use in his documentary, which was shown on PBS, he loaned this film element of Robert Groden's to David Lifton. David Lifton borrowed a bunch of money from relatives, actually rented an Oxbury optical printer, and made his own copies of this beautiful film element. Subsequently, Robert Groden found out Lifton had the copy. He was very upset. Lifton had to return it immediately to Richter. Richter returned it to Groden. But I know from this tale of events, and yes, I do believe what Lifton told me, that Robert Groden had then a 35 millimeter Duke negative of the Zapruder film, which was obviously made from whatever Moses Weitzman had created in 1968 when he blew the film up from 8 millimeter to 35 millimeter. I'm sure that's what Robert Groden loaned to Oliver Stone as well.
I just wanted to say that all this is described in your book, Jim, The Great Zapruder Film Hoax.
Yeah. Well, Doug has done so much great work, but I love hearing him talk about it. This is terrific, Larry.
You're looking at some crappy 16 millimeter film element. You're looking at the beautiful 35 millimeter inner negative, turned into a positive on the big screen. That film Oliver Stone displayed wouldn't have looked that good if it had been made from 16 millimeter. So I know that's his best film element. He told me that his best film element was 16 millimeter. Subsequently, Robert finally spoke with Sidney and Tom. They finally called him and they had some long conversations. They offered in person. They repeated the offer I had first relayed as a middleman. They offered in person to fly him to California, to show him their scans, explain their work to him if he would come out and bring his own best film element and let them digitally scan it. And in exchange, to show their good faith, they sent him some of their best scans electronically. They sent them to him. And Robert told them that his best film element was only a 16 millimeter film, which I know is not true. And he never did take them up on the offer. And it was to my great dismay, ST, I must say, I was very disappointed. When you asked Robert Groden point blank in episode 103, you said to him, quote, "Did you receive an offer from Sidney and Tom to fly you out to LA and show you their material?" End quote. That was your question. And he said, "No, I didn't." That's not just a mistake, that's a lie. And I can only conclude that the reason for not telling the truth is that to admit that that was true would be to admit that you didn't have enough curiosity to examine new evidence. Also, that you didn't want to share with other researchers for the sake of advancing the cause of research, but mostly that you were in denial and you didn't want to examine new evidence, so he turned them down. I'm telling you, I believe my friends. They confirmed it to me on the phone on November 20th, and they confirmed it to me in writing again last night in an email. So,
but again, this is consistent with. I have to go back to your book, Jim, The Great Zapruder Film Hoax. Okay, where Groden, it is described, in the chapter "Pig on a Leash," where
By David Lifton.
Yes, where he refused to share the goods with other researchers. And what Douglas is describing here is exactly what you wrote in, what you have in your book, Jim.
No, you're absolutely right, Larry. But it's great to hear Doug talk about it and recount it in the context of the relationship with Sidney Wilkinson, which didn't exist at that time.
Right, let's continue.
I'm not happy about that. Now, in Dallas, as you know, because you were present at one of the screenings, ST, you were at the Judy Baker conference, correct?
I was, yes.
Now, I know from someone who was there, who told me this, that Robert Groden left the room at the Judy Baker conference. He left the room before Sidney and Tom showed their preview of their research on the Zapruder film. He left the room and didn't come back in the room until their preview was over. He then proceeded to get up on stage and rebutted their work as sadly mistaken without having even seen their preview to their documentary. That's just, I think it's shameful. It indicates a closed mind, an indication not to consider new evidence. And so I've also listened.
I just want to say, Jim, I was there. Jim had not arrived yet. He was still on his way to the conference. And what Groden said was that they were mistaking shadows, shadows for that patch.
No, I was there when he said it, Larry. I was there when he said it. It was outrageous. It was outrageous.
Yeah,
it was utterly indefensible, scientifically ridiculous. He was making a complete fool of himself in his belief that he could deceive the audience. I was shocked.
Right, let's go.
to an audio recording of what he said on stage at the Judy Baker conference in attempting to rebut their work. And he's saying these things without even looking at their film preview. In other words, he didn't have the benefit of experiencing and listening to the gravitas of Paul Rattan and Garrett Smith and Ned Price when these three Hollywood film professionals discussed what they were seeing in these digital scans. And he certainly did have the benefit of having received copies of some of these scans, which Sidney and Tom sent to him, but he didn't want to see their preview and was trying to rebut it without having viewed it, which is just bad form, to say the least. Now, he stood up at the conference. I've got the audio of this, and he said that this so-called black patch, which Sidney and Tom call an optical patch, a black patch on the back of JFK's head, which you see in various shapes and sizes from frame 313 through at least 337. This black patch is only a deep, dark shadow over the hole caused by the exit wound. In other words, Robert would have us believe that these people don't know the difference, that Sidney and Tom and the 72 film experts who agree the film isn't right, that they are confusing a shadow for an optical patch. I'm telling you that the opinions of 72 Hollywood film experts, people who are film editors, film colorists, and post-production experts, post-production mastering experts, and film restoration experts, he would have us believe that they're all wrong and that Sidney and Tom are wrong, and that they are, according to Robert Groden, that they are actually looking into the hole in the back of JFK's head, and it's covered up by a shadow, and so it's not really a black optical patch. They're just looking at the hole. But of course, Robert can't explain why in frame 317, why the so-called hole has perfectly straight lines along the top edge of the black patch and along the right side of the black patch. This black trapezoid in frame 317.
Larry, let me add.
Any hole that looked like
that. When I was in Sydney's studio, we looked at some of the frames, of course. I mean, it's a 26-second film. It was so blatant. You know, it's as though they took a piece of black tape and stuck it up there. I think they blew up the film and actually painted it over in black and then shrunk it back down. I mean, it's that blatant. It's completely ridiculous, and it moves around, which is indicative.
Right.
The story is just poppycock.
Right.
I mean, it's embarrassing to even listen. You know, that anyone in JFK research would make such an argument is a disgrace.
Without even looking at the evidence.
Without even looking at their work.
Yeah, and the saddest part is that he had to come out of retirement because this was so outrageous. You know.
Well, it's a good thing. I'm so glad he did.
Yeah.
Well, one of my main thesis in my book is that technology has finally caught up, with photographic evidence. All right, and it's going to continue to demolish, as technology continues to advance. All right.
This is why NASA, about 10 years ago, they found a treasure trove of moon landing footage. And instead of preserving this most priceless footage, were it real, they destroyed it because it's not.
Of course. All right. Let's
continue.
In 2011, have you ever seen a shadow like this that had perfectly straight edges on a human being before in an image? And Dino Brugione said, no, not on human hair, I haven't. He said, not on human hair. He said, no. And then he pointed at Jackie Kennedy's hair, where the shadows are much more, the real.
Larry, pull your arrow over to the back of the head, where, just show what he's talking about, the back of the head.
He said, this is definitely an anomaly. And he took his pointer and drew a square around the black patch in frame 317. He said, this is definitely an anomaly. Now, Dino ought to know something about this because he wrote a book about photo fakery. And if somebody wants to challenge his credentials, they can go buy it from a used bookstore, a book called Photo Fakery by Dino Brugione. So these were his considered opinions. Now, as soon as I published my book in November 2009, my 5-volume book, and volume 4 contained my big Zapruder film chapter, there was immediate pushback from people like Gary Mack and David Rohn and Tim Thompson, people who don't want to believe the film is altered for various reasons. Part of the pushback was a paper written by somebody named Haney Farid, F-A-R-I-D. I don't know who Haney Farid is, but Haney Farid is not a...
Okay, Dr. Fetzer, who's Haney Farid?
He's an FBI stooge who set up a lab financed by the FBI at Dartmouth, of all places. I even wrote to the president of Dartmouth at the time when he claimed to authenticate the backyard photographs on the basis of the nose shadow alone, Larry.
Thank you.
It was so outrageous. I mean, the fallacies this guy was committing right there in front of God and everybody. I mean, it was breathtaking.
You wrote the University of Dartmouth, didn't you?
I did.
Mm-hmm.
I did indeed. I mean, what a disgrace on Dartmouth.
Yeah, let's continue.
Expert. Haney Farid is in the computer science department at Dartmouth, or was when Haney Farid wrote this article. So in the interest of transparency, I have put the link to this attempted rebuttal of frame 317 as an alteration. I put this link up on your site. People are free to read what he wrote, he or she. I don't even know if Haney Farid is a male or female, but Haney Farid wrote a rebuttal to what I put in my book about frame 317. And then Haney Farid reproduced a computer-generated shadow on the back of JFK's head as his head appears in the film, in that frame. And I thought it was a very poor attempted rebuttal, because if you look at the shadow, the artificial shadow that Farid created on his artificial head, his CGI created head, it's a very gradual shadow that's very gradually phased in. There are no sharp edges of it. There's no sharp edge at the top of the shadow where you go from hair to suddenly, almost D-max black right away. And there are no sharp edges. So that's one way in which I think the paper written by Farid just doesn't stand on its own legs. All you have to do is look at frame 317.
Yes, Larry, let me interject. The reason they do things like that is that you're trying to create a state of uncertainty in the mind of the public. This was the astute observation of the author of history will not resolve us, namely that the objective of disinformation is not to settle the matter one way or another, but to create enough uncertainty that everything is believable and nothing is knowable. By having someone who looks on its face to be an authority like Haney Farid of the FBI from Dartmouth, who's making the claim it's just a shadow, that can create enough uncertainty in the mind of non-experts that they don't know what to believe. And they have thereby succeeded in their objective with this information.
Right, to muddy the waters. All right. Let's go.
Called First Version Sent, frame 317. It's an HD scan. It's a 2K scan. First version sent to me. That excerpt from the frame shows both Kennedy and Connolly in the frame at the same moment in time, with the sun at the same angle. And if they can blow the image up, I hope they can, you'll see that there's a real shadow on Connolly's head. It's on the right side of his head, and it's gray, it's not black, and it gradually forms as his head curves. And then you look at JFK's head, and the black patch just jumps out and hits you right between the eyes. And it's clearly something artificial. It's clearly not a real shadow. All you have to do is compare it to Connolly's shadow. And that's the argument that Farid couldn't engage in. So Farid ignores that argument, and Farid doesn't talk about the shadow on Connolly's head. Of course, Farid should have compared the two, but didn't. I'll tell you who did compare the two shadows that you see in the frame 317 image on your page, the one that's called First Version Sent. A NASA imaging scientist at NASA Glenn Center. Now, there's a middleman who I won't name who got a PhD in physics, an imaging scientist at NASA Glenn, to look at the scans of frame 317 made by Sidney and Tom. And that guy studied the data using software called Line Profile and made two numerical graphs. So there's a slide called the NASA slide, which you posted at my request. And that NASA slide shows a graphic display of how dark the back of JFK's head is, the black patch, versus how dark the shadow on Connolly's head is in the same film frame. And you'll see that in the case of the black patch on JFK's head, it's maxed out. It's
not only on Connolly, but also on Jackie. You know,
Yes, good, Larry. Right, there are lots of shadows in there.
Yeah, this is Costella, and obviously, you know, we have a little bit more tint, more color. Okay, I'd like this to be a little less saturated with the color, Jim. I don't know if you agree with that, so that we could appreciate.
Are you putting up a frame, Larry? We can't see it.
Oh, you can't see it? I got 317 up.
Put it up.
Okay, hold on. Hold on. Stop share.
Okay, go ahead and hit pause real quick.
Yeah, you got it there?
Yeah, we got it.
We got it now.
Okay, what Douglas is talking about here is, this is Connolly, and you can see the uniform and the curvature of his head. Okay, and you can see that you can still see flesh tones here, and you can same with Jackie, but with JFK, there's this patch covering the back of the head here. Okay, so that's what Douglas is talking about.
Leave that frame up, Larry, while you continue.
Yeah, I will.
99% as black as it can get, totally black. You see that in the graph. And on Connolly's head, you see a gradual shadow that changes how dark it is. It goes up and down on the graph. So that's the other disclaimer that disproves the Fareed article, is the NASA slide. And the NASA slide, I want to point out, was the private work of the PhD in physics, the imaging scientist. It happens to have the NASA logo on it. It's not endorsed by NASA, the agency. It's just the software that he had to use to create a slide. So it's his individual work. But that slide was very persuasive to Garrett Smith, who talked about it on camera for Sidney and Tom. He talked about the importance of the data displayed in that slide, which helped convince him that he's looking at something added to that frame. So Mr. Groden claimed on your show, episode 103, that scanning film frames digitally creates digital artifacts, quote unquote. Scanning frames creates digital artifacts.
Really?
Thus implying that perhaps frame 317 and the other nearby frames like it are simply artifacts generated by digital scanning. This is nonsense. If you look at the digital scans, at the resolution at which they were created, in other words, to look at a 6K scan without compressing it, without compressing the image, you would have to look at it displayed on a huge movie screen in a screening room. And Sidney and Tom have done that. And then they have to reduce it a little bit to look at it on a 2K HD monitor. But when they look at it, a 6K scan on a 2K monitor, it looks the same and it doesn't look any different. And when they view their 2K scans, and I've given you some of those to post, they can actually look at the actual information on a monitor with the same resolution. So your HD TV monitor today that would show a Blu-ray picture, a 2K TV set, a 1080p TV, you can look at the actual 2K scan without any compression taking place. So although theoretically compressing a very high resolution digital image could possibly create a digital artifact, it has not happened with these images because Sidney and Tom have compressed the 6K down to these TIFFs that I'm showing on your website here. The TIFF of frame 313 and the TIFF of...
I want to just interject here. The TIFF is a TIFF is a much higher resolution image. It goes way beyond, JPEGs and PNGs. Okay.
Oh, really, Larry? I'm glad to hear this.
Yes. TIFFs, TIFFs.
Yeah.
The size of these images are just incredible. Okay.
Well, let me just say about digital technology and why Doug's right and Groden's wrong is that it reproduces on a pixel by pixel basis. This is why it can be replicable again and again with no loss. with ordinary analog, like reproducing on a Xerox machine. You take a first generation scan and then you make a scan of the second and the third, and very rapidly distortions show up. But with digital technology, it remains just as exact as the original.
That's right. In fact, yeah, that's right. And that's why TIFF is so important, that format, digital format. Let me continue.
Frame 317. And the black patch looks the same in those TIFF compressed images that it does on a huge movie screen in a screening room. So that is a claim he made that does not apply to their work. Now, by the way, one of the frames I've displayed is a TIFF of frame 323. So there are two other egregious frames that are just as bad as 317 in their own way, and maybe worse, and that's frame 321 and 323. So I've displayed one of those two frames, 323, because they look almost the same. And it looks like somebody got carried away, some visual effects artist got carried away with his paintbrush or his tool, his black marking tool, and he's actually painted a couple of black spikes into the shadow covering up the back of Kennedy's head. One black spike extends into his jawline, which is ridiculous.
Can you guys see that? Can you see that?
Yeah, use your arrow, Larry.
I'm sorry?
Use your arrow. Use your cursor to show it.
Yeah, I've got 323 on the screen. Can you see it?
Yeah.
We can see it, but we want you to use your arrow to show exactly what you're talking about.
Which is another indication of forgery. I mean, the artwork was too big, and it went over something that should be.
I mean, this one. I mean,
like his jaw.
Yeah, he's talking about that little black part.
Yeah. I mean, this one. I think 317. You know, but this one just takes a cake, Jim.
317 is classic, but 223 here. I mean, it's too large a block. I mean, they blocked out more of his head than was.
And then
he had to conceal.
This one. I mean, this is an unbelievable. It's like he says, egregious.
Yeah.
You know, completely.
This is like a caricature of what they were trying to do.
Yeah, you can see, you know, how it's been completely airbrushed here. You know, and like Douglas says, you've got spikes coming out here and here into the jawline here. Yeah. I mean, it's just unbelievable.
Sloppy work.
As bad as it gets.
This is why the Hollywood restoration experts were so dumbfounded when they actually began to study the Zapruder film.
Yeah, I know. And anybody who still thinks that the Z film has not been altered, I mean, it's got to be.
It's the most closely guarded secret in the whole JFK.
Okay, let's continue.
Next to Lee in the doorway.
Episode 103 that the digital scanning of film frames increases Dmax in an image. That is an outrageous claim that's totally unsupported by any facts. Dmax, for your audience, is the darkest an image can get. Okay, that's technical talk for blackest black there can be. And the black patch in frame 317 is very close to virtual Dmax. It's just about as black as it can be. And you can look at the NASA slide and see that. Look at the graphic data on the NASA slide. So his claim that the digital scanning of their frames that Sidney and Tom did has increased Dmax in their images is totally false, because actually that's the opposite of what happens in log color scans. I've already explained to your audience that in log color scans, the blacks are stretched into grays, and you can actually see more information, not less. So this is a claim Robert made, which is completely incorrect. So he either doesn't understand what he's talking about, or even worse, he does, and he's just lying about it. So I'm going to choose that to opt for the former and just assume that he doesn't know what he's talking about, because that statement is incorrect. Now, Robert made a claim in episode 103 that's the classic attempt by somebody in a debate to set up a straw man. You try to characterize the other side's argument so you can easily knock it down like a scarecrow in the field. Straw man. And what he did is just unforgivable. He said that, I'm paraphrasing, that in so many words, what Sidney and Tom are claiming is that somebody altered the camera original Zapruder film by drawing on the emulsion side of each tiny, tiny original 8mm film frame with a Sharpie, with a microscopic Sharpie, to create what Sidney and Tom call black patches on the back of JFK's head. He actually said that. I almost fell out of my chair. I was stunned when I listened to him say that during podcast 103. He's actually claiming that my good friends are claiming something they've never claimed. They've never claimed that. So he makes an argument that's ridiculous. Nobody would alter a film by actually drawing on an original film frame with a black pen. Give me a break. Paul Rutan, film expert Paul Rutan, who's in the film preview, I have extended excerpts of his interview in 2013, is positive that this work was done on an aerial optical printer, an aerial imaging optical printer. And what an aerial imaging optical printer is, folks, and Robert should know this, it is a large optical printer with an animation stand installed in the middle of it. Now, to help people understand what this is, I've included two images for your audience to look at. One is a schematic diagram of an aerial imaging optical printer, and one is an actual photograph of an aerial image optical printer made by the Oxbury Company with an animation stand in the middle. So if people would just look at the drawing, the simplistic drawing, imagine an original film placed on the bottom of the drawing on the right-hand side. The original film is going to be projected off a mirror, 45-degree angle mirror, and it's going to shoot straight up in the air through the animation stand. The animation stand has condenser lenses in it, and if you put a piece of tracing paper over the top condenser lens, the image, which is suspended in the air, suddenly appears. You can see what's on that film frame. And you do this one at a time, one film frame at a time. Then, to alter an image, all you have to do is lay an acetate cell, a clear piece of plastic used by visual effects artists, the type of cell that Walt Disney artists have been using since the 1930s. Lay an acetate cell over the top of the animation stand, over the top of the film frame being displayed. So the animation stand is about 10.5 inches by 10.5 inches in size. The acetate cell would be the same size. Paint over what you don't like with your black paint. Paint on what you want to paint on, like a large head wound at the top of the head, which nobody saw in Dallas. Absolutely nobody. Jackie didn't see a head wound at the top of the head or the front of the head. Nobody at Parkland saw a head wound at the top of the head or the front of the head. None of the people standing around the president at the gurney, directly at his arms and legs, saw that. You would paint on what you want to cover up, paint on what you want other people to see. Then you remove the tracing paper, and you're going to rephotograph each frame from above with a process camera. So this type of alteration involves looking at each frame one at a time, putting an acetate cell over the projected image, painting out what you don't want people to see, painting on what you do want people to see, and then rephotographing each frame from above in a process camera.
Can you guys see the optical printer?
Yeah. We see it, Larry. It's good.
Yeah.
So-called
Never seen it before.
one frame at a time. If there are frames you want to remove from a film, like a car turning a corner or something else, or exit debris leaving the rear of the president's head, you would simply engage in step printing. You're not, in other words, you're not going to print every single frame in the new process camera. You're going to skip the frames you don't want to print and just remove them optically without any physical splice. Optical frame scission. So these two diagrams that I provided, the diagram and the photograph with aerial imaging optical printers, came from the state-of-the-art textbook from 1965. The name of that book is The Technique of Special Effects Cinematography, written by Professor Raymond Fielding, published by the University of Houston in 1965, with many subsequent editions where they would add additional illustrations. And I bought a used copy when writing my Zapruder film chapter, and anyone else who wants to learn about these things can buy a copy for themselves. He was the first person to write a textbook about the visual black arts of Hollywood. And basically what he explains about the state-of-the-art in the 50s and 60s is that there were two ways to add visual effects to films. One was called the use of a traveling mat, and the other is aerial imaging. The traveling mat is much more extensive and involves 3 or 4 passes through a process camera, a lot of contrast buildup, and if you don't use very precise pins in lining up the different mats of the image, you're going to have significant registration error in the new film. So I'm telling your audience tonight that I early on ruled out the use of traveling mats to alter the Zapruder film. If they had been used, you would see massive registration error in the film, and you would see a lot more contrast buildup than you see, which you don't see very much. You just see a little bit. The technique obviously used was aerial imaging. Aerial imaging is self-matting, in that if you paint a black patch over the back of somebody's head and rephotograph it from above in the process camera, that's it. It covers up whatever you want to cover up because the paint is opaque. If you paint a large head wound on the top of the head, it's there and it covers up what used to be there before, which was an intact top of the head. If you want to remove part of a head explosion because you don't want people to see it for one reason or another, you just use step printing to exclude those frames.
Larry, I think we could return to this next week if you like, if there's that much more to cover, which there may very well be.
I know. I wanted to jump up to 3:12, I believe. Hold on. Can you stop the recording?
All right, we're going to pause right there. We're going to go ahead and continue this most interesting conversation, and we're just showing you the things that we face trying to bring truth to the JFK community.
We're just scratching the surface on this, Gary, because this type of a technique that Douglas is presenting here in this presentation is exactly what was available as a technology of the time.
Yes, wonderful. You're showing a great job, Larry. We'll continue next week.
Yeah, JFK 229. We'll see you next week.